Oh, thank you very much indeed, and welcome to the Judge Business School this evening for our discussion of does prisons work. And the kind of the tag underneath this, in terms of the questions that we'll be exploring, is how can institutionalisation be prevented? Are there effective alternatives to prison? And what circumstances discourage repeat offenders? It's my pleasure to introduce, first of all, Emma Disley, who is a researcher at RAND Europe in the Communities, Safety and Justice programme.
RAND is an independent and not-for-profit research organisation, and our mission is to improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis.
So for years, criminological researchers have tried to identify what works to reduce reoffending. And there's a huge body of evidence on this, and in fact we know some things quite well. I think the summary of it is some things can work for some people some of the time. So we know what features an effective drug treatment scheme might have, or what features an effective scheme to build family relationships or improve education might be. But what the evidence really tells us is that the way the programme's implemented is very, very important. So if you know what the successful features of a programme are, then the practitioners who are implementing that programme must be very well trained. They must reproduce the programme very carefully. The environment must be just right. And so the problem with rehabilitation in a prison is, first of all, some people don't spend very long in a prison, so if you start a programme, it might be difficult to continue it in the community. Also, if a prison is overcrowded, it means staff have less time to help you with problems or to deliver the programmes. And because our prisons are quite full, we tend to move offenders between prisons to even out the numbers. And again, this is disruptive, because if you've started a programme, it might be difficult to finish it.
We release something like about 70 to 80,000 prisoners a year. So somewhere between, certainly over half the prison population is actually very, very close to release. It's probably within 12 months of release. Significant numbers of people are about to go back out into the community. But what prisons are we building? We're building secure prisons. We're building secure Category B prisons. We're building them big, we're building them cheap, and we're going to run them cheap, and they're going to be run by the private sector. What we're not building is the sort of prisons that would help people break the cycle, and those are prisons that would help people transition back into the community in a better way. What I would argue is that keeping people in prison fairly easy. Getting people out successfully is the very difficult bit. We have an over-reliance on keeping people in custody, on preventing them escape, rather than supporting them getting back into the community. I would argue that most people don't really want to escape. There's kind of nowhere to go. And there are people who are now not even applying for early release, not applying for parole, because they know if they get out there, such are the hurdles, such are the difficulties, that they know they're going to fail. We have huge numbers of people go out on licence and they're breached because they can't conform to the terms and conditions. So we're not doing enough to support people through that transition. That's the difficult bit. And we should be measuring the prison service on those kinds of measures, on that transition back into the community, rather than on something as simple and straightforward as escapes.
It's difficult. What should we be doing, and this is a plug for the RSA, one of the project we've got on at the moment is one called Transitions. And we are looking at the way in which we can transition people back into the community. And that's about people being in custody, but perhaps working out. It's about bringing work into the prison. It's about bringing prisoners out into the environment. It's about making that transition easier than it is at the moment. Because being released from prison can be quite dangerous. It can be quite traumatic. Deaths from drug overdose of recently released prisoners is very high. You don't read much about it. You read about suicides in prison, but you don't read about the prisoners who are dying because they haven't been prepared in terms of their illicit and official drug use before they're released. The suicide rate of people recently released from prison is equivalent to that of a psychiatric patient.
I'm an ex-offender. I've got 20 odd years in prison behind me from the age of 14 up to 40. I've got 41 previous convictions for various offences, from fraud, deception, burglary, TDA, twocking, nicking people's cars, a couple of drug offences, bit of street violence, just nothing heavy, a couple of fights, you know. But for the last 18 years I've been teaching in schools and colleges, and what I do is I bring prison to the U. And what I mean by that is I put a prison cell on the stage and I get a couple of the kids, I put some prison clothes on them, throw them in the cell for a couple of hours, 3, 4 hours, depending on how long the presentation is. And that could be 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon. And if you can prevent a young person from going down the same path that I went down, I call it a slippery slope, then I've made a success. And I've done that. What I'm looking to do now is to look for ex-offenders that could do this sort of work, not only stand up in front of 300 or 400 kids and talk about their life for 2 hours, but then you train them as mentors as well. And then by doing that, what you're doing is again, you're saying to the ex-offender man or woman, you know, you're telling yourself what you can do to prevent yourself going down that path. And then you also start training programs in the prisons so that when a young person gets nicked, you've got a mentor that's trained to work with that person from day one. That's called rehabilitation, from as soon as possible. You know, this subject today is about, does prison work? No, it doesn't work. Institutionalisation, I'm still institutionalised. I'm in prison every day of my life. Alternatives to prison, I'll give you untold alternatives to prison. Untold.
Funny enough, I don't want to talk to you about prisons today. I want to talk to you about alternatives to prison, because the overwhelming evidence suggests that there are alternatives to the prison as an idea, and prison as a tool, as a social tool, that work much better than the prison. It's not that I'm saying that the prison should not be there, but I am saying that there are things that are more effective, cost much less, and create safer streets. And that tool is, in fact, the police and other social services that are around the prison system before and after prisoners are either enter the prison system or released from the prison system. 21st century policing is about deterrence and it's about prevention. It's about reacting to crime before it happens. And that's the premise of 21st century criminology. We have found that less than 5% of places in most cities around the world produce 50% of the crime. 50% of the crime. So if you focus on these hotspots, and when we talk about hotspots, we're talking about a very small geographic location, a few 50 meter grid, 50 meter grid. If you focus on these hotspots, you'll be able to reduce crime, but more than 50%. And since you cannot send the police officers to just walk about the entire city, if you focus on these areas, then you'll be able to reduce crime with less resources.
My question was connected with that, in that I wonder how much media act on people's perceptions, and then the government find the easy route out and just go with what the Daily Express is telling my mum about locking everybody up in prison and what a good idea that is. So I think the two things are sort of connected in a way.
Let's just say, let's see. I think you've highlighted a real problem there, and it is that particularly politicians, they see all prisoners as the same, and I think it's illustrated in the attitude to voting for prisoners. What the European Court has said is that our blanket ban of voting for prisoners, all prisoners on all occasions, forever, till hell freezes over, is wrong and inappropriate, and that as a country we should have a more rational approach. And maybe, maybe we don't want to give people serving life sentences a vote, but as I said before, 60,000 prisoners a year are being released, so maybe it would be a good idea to get them on the electoral register, because with the electoral register comes the need to have somewhere to live and some identification with the community. But you hear some of the parliamentarians at the moment, everyone in prison is a murderist and a rapist and a robber. Yes, there are murderers, rapists and robbers, and there are people who need to be kept in prison for a long period of time. But also in prison are a lot of them, but for the grace of God, go a lot of us, or our children. And we need a more rational approach, that there are a range of people in prison, and we need to start dealing with people in prison as the very heterogeneous group that they are. And a lot of who's in prison? Members of the community passing through. Members of your community and my community, and they're passing through very, very rapidly. And if we treat them all as murderers, rapists and robbers that are going to
rape and pillage in our beds, then we're not going to get very far. We need a rational approach, and the papers aren't going to give it to us, the politicians aren't going to give it to us. We need the public, we need people like you to be giving some rationality to this debate.
About the hotspot policing, I wanted to ask you whether you've done any work on finding out when you're dealing with an area where there is a hotspot and you send people in and it reduces the crime, does that crime just get moved along to another area?
I would like to respond to the displacement question, where the crime moves around the corner or it doesn't. And the intuition says that it does, in the sense that the crime will actually move around the corner and will be displaced to adjacent areas next to the hotspot. There's overwhelming evidence to suggest that it doesn't, although it is counterintuitive. And there's an experiment by David Weisberg that shows it very clearly that there is no displacement of crime to adjacent areas. And when there is displacement, when crime does move around the corner, it's not at the same level that it was at the original hotspot. So, and which is the reason why David Weisberg has won the Stockholm Prize for Criminology, which is parallel to the Nobel Prize, simply because he found that, which is so counterintuitive, and there is evidence to suggest that it doesn't happen.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I think it's a very good note to end on. Thank you very much indeed for